Hello, I'm Ted Leverette, broadcasting from partneroncall.com. I'm the original business buyer advocate. For more than 30 years, I've been helping people worldwide find and buy the right businesses the right way. You're going to hear my conversation with Paul D. Hauck, a consultant and business broker in Sydney, Australia. The name of his firm is ICT Strategic Consulting. Paul helps technology-driven business owners and operators build the value of their businesses and ultimately realize that value through an exit. One of the most important things he does for clients is to help them avoid the traps and reap the rewards of success. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the seller perspective versus the buyer perspective. We're going to talk about pitfalls from actual deals and deal making and wishful thinking. So Paul, when we were talking the other day, we were talking about the difference in perspective, the seller perspective and the buyer perspective on the buying and selling of small and mid-sized businesses. Can you talk more about that from let's say the seller side?
Sure, yeah, about 70% of the work that we do is sell side, so we get really used to that. I think on the buy side and the sell side, people have a very different view of what's going to happen. But really the most important thing is the strategic value. And if a buyer's got an existing business or they're putting businesses together, they're creating a lot of value in that. And the seller's got to, come to the party and wants to share in some of that. But a lot of it depends on the seller's perspective as to whether they're going to stay around. If they're exiting, they really don't care what the value is going forward. They're in it for the cash. Whereas the buyer's got a much more long-term view of how things are going to work. It gets really interesting when vendors are going to be selling up. They're going to be selling into something that's ongoing and becoming hopefully a productive employee. And there's a lot of pitfalls in that. When it works really well, particularly for smaller companies, because those small vendors have built that up and they're critically dependent on those people. So if you lose them, you lose a lot. But you've got to take somebody who's been running a company for 1 to 10 years and make them into an employee, and that can be hard. That can be a really difficult transition. And I think that's probably one of the biggest differences in perspective is looking at the future for the buyer and seller. And the other one is really looking at the transaction, because the buyer is looking at typically one business or one of a few that he's looking at. And the seller, you may have been the first knock on the door for them and they're seeing a whole new opportunity, something they didn't know was around. Or they may have a very effective broker like myself who's been speaking to 200 potential buyers, and you as a buyer then have to outbid that whole pack. So there's a very different dynamic in all of those situations. But you're primarily on the buy side, Ted. What have you seen through all that?
Well, one of the things that scares us the most is buyer competition. So when I'm dealing with my buyer clients, actually the searchers before they're even buyers, we say it's all about positioning. And what that means is getting that buyer or that searcher so prepared that when they meet an owner or a seller or a broker, they look really good. They look qualified. We're willing to show what we bring to the table. We're willing to disclose that we have an advisory team. And if anybody checks out that advisory team, they'll find out that the people are all known to facilitate deals that should occur, not deal killers. And in my case, I won't work with buyers if I don't have some view into who they have as a lawyer or a solicitor or their accountant, because if they're not known to make deals, I don't want them.
You raise a good point there that I specialize in IT, second and third tier IT companies. And when a buyer comes in, there's one thing that probably 80% of these guys find more attractive than anything else except the money. And that's the buyer who can sell. Because all of these guys have been out there spending, 5 or 10 years trying to figure out how to get their marketing and sales on track and working. And generally, if they've succeeded, you can't afford them. And if they haven't, if you can come in and solve that problem for them, they're walking right into the deal with you.
Those are the easiest clients for me to represent, the buyers who have the marketing background, because we can hire accountants, we can hire operations people. And what we love is so many owners that are selling, marketing is not their forte. They're pretty much operational kind of people. And so we like them to hang around for a while and focus on the operation, and we just amp up the marketing big time. So sellers like to exit knowing that the company is going to go forward, and so do their employees. Make sense?
Absolutely. And that's the biggest way to add value to the vast majority of the companies that I see anyway. Beautiful. So if you've got those buyers, you can bring them to me, Ted.
Well, I'm working on that real hard. I'm in South Florida, you're in Australia, and I'm doing my best, and starting with you, by the way, trying to make better inroads down under.
We're all on Zoom now, Ted, so it doesn't matter if you're in Melbourne, Florida or Melbourne, Victoria. You're still on Zoom.
Yeah, look what we're doing right now.
Exactly.
And it's interesting we're talking about that, because one of the buyers, or excuse me, one of the searchers who just hired me, he said, how is this virtual revolution going to play out? Is business going to materially change because we can do what we're doing now? We don't have to be out in the field as much. What do you think?
I'm really interested to see that. And particularly interested because a lot of my guys are the ones who are out there putting in place the remote connections and supporting all the IT and getting everybody connected up. And they've just now gotten to the point where they're on top of the thousands of tickets they've had to deal with for that. Most are expecting to see probably an 80% return to the way we were before. So a lot more people will be able to work flexibly from home. But you're still going to want to have them in the office. You're still going to want to build that team capability and all that. We might save a bit on real estate. Hopefully we'll have staggered starting and finishing times, so our transport infrastructure and all that behaves a little bit better. But I think one of the things coming out of this that surprised most people is how resilient the internet has been. The idea that we can all work from home and still watch Netflix, and this still works. So I think people have sort of broken the egg a little bit in terms of working remotely, and you're going to see a lot more of it happen. But gee, I miss having coffee with people. I'm going back to that.
Well, let's go from the cheery news to talk about what are some of the pitfalls that you've seen for deals that occurred? Actually,
talking about disasters, this is really opening the kimono for you there, Ted. Yeah, thinking of the ones we've had, I can think of a few recent ones and a few more typical ones. The one we had most recently was really a due diligence failure. And, well, full disclosure, I was on the vendor side of this. We sold a business that had a really top-notch data center in the middle of it. And about 9 or 10 months after the acquisition completed, the buyer found out that my vendor had built the whole thing with unlicensed software.
Oh boy.
And in the due diligence process, they'd never really unearthed that. They never asked the question. Boy, we had a mess to sort out from there. But yeah, that was a big mess to unravel all of that. And we're checking that in due diligence every time we're after it now. A surprisingly complicated mess to unravel as well, because the contracts have all closed, the money's all changed hands, and what do? Go back and open it all up? The answer is no, but I'll tell you more about that another time. The other one we had recently was a staff member. We had again, I was on the vendor side of this transaction, and immediately after the deal closed, there was one staff member, a real guru, great relationships with the client, great guy. He'd been with the vendor for probably more than 10 years. He turned around and came to the buyer the day after with a laundry list of wanting triple his salary, a fantastic car, 3-year no-cut contract, and a partridge in a pear tree. And he was holding under ransom saying, the biggest customer you just bought loves me. Either pay my freight or I'm going to take him and go private. And you can't allow that to happen through the staff. And back and forth. In the end, he wound up carrying through on his threat. That was very expensive for them. Surprisingly, that buyer is still a really good friend of mine. So you got to work to get over these things. Oh, what else have we got? One we're working through at the moment, actually. The vendors, let's say we're not accountants, but they put together about a $12 million telco company, a very strong partner for the biggest telco here. And their accounting was unbelievably poor. We didn't know this until the final phase of the transaction, in which we had to do some balance sheet adjustments. And as soon as we got into auditing the balance sheet, we saw double counting, failures to accrue, all sorts of, hundreds of thousands of dollars a day, just moving one way or the other. And we're still sorting that one out. It's all about due diligence. And, on the buy side, as you were saying before, it's all about having the right people looking for the right things, isn't it?
One of the things besides making these searchers look good to sellers and brokers is once they let us in and we have our nose under the tent, it's really important that we prioritize the due diligence. And what we try to do, and you've named some of them, we try to anticipate for a particular business what are most likely are going to be the deal killers. And we get tipped off on that because most of my clients are buying businesses and industries they know something about, and so they know what the hot buttons are. And my feeling is it's better to abort a deal now, because if it's destined to die later, let's not even bother. And a few of the things that we really zero in on, because these are the things that cause deals to fall apart either at the beginning or the end. The biggest one, at least in the States, the United States, is financing. If the sellers are not going to step forward, or the vendors are not going to step forward and finance part of the buyer's purchase, the deal's not going to happen. Not in the year 2020. Bank financing here is getting extremely difficult for acquisitions. I mean, you hear that we're giving away free money, and we are, but not for acquisitions. Not for acquisitions, but for operations and for payroll. So right now, our Small Business Administration, for example, they're so buried in paperwork handling the giveaways, they just don't have time. Here, if the vendors or the sellers are not going to provide quite a bit of financing, deals are not going to get done. And what they're asking buyers to do is make huge down payments. And what I tell my clients is only the most naive buyers do that. Don't do that. If the seller won't.
We tend to get in IT.
Yep.
It works as vendor finance, but typically it's structured as an earnout. And this is typically a risk balancing exercise between the vendor, who may have grand aspirations for the company in the coming future and want to be paid for it, and the buyer, who is more than happy to pay for great achievements once they're achieved. So by deferring typically 50% of whatever the payment is over 12, 24, or sometimes 36 months, and keying that to the performance of either the business or that part of the business going forward, it balances the risk, and it also provides the financing element. So we're doing a lot of that. We always have here. Bank finance, Australian banks don't finance acquisitions. They're very conservative that way. So it's somewhat of a different environment, which can be a great opportunity for international buyers coming in, because typically for U.S. buyers buying into Australia, we have a much more constrained financing environment and pretty constrained valuations by American standards. So where we can find the right deal for that sort of a buyer, it can be excellent for both parties.
Wow. Yeah. Here, the earnouts, sellers will do just about anything not to agree to them. And the business broker industry now, because of the pandemic and our financial crisis, they are telling sellers you're going to need to do more of it, but it's pretty tough. And at 50% of the consideration or the purchase price, that would be very rare in the United States. But I think we're going to see more of it.
I think it's IT is kind of more prone to that, just because for the last 20 or 30 years, you've seen so many IT companies that have exploded. You know, and when you're dealing with a growth stage company that might be in the 5 to 10 mil revenue range, you know, they're seeing themselves as on the launch pad. Often they're wrong about that, but you know, it's still the view that they've got, and everybody wants that to happen. You know, so the more we can do to foster that, the better. But at the same time, you know, buying a forecast is a dangerous business. So,
well, you know, part of that forecast relates to key employees that you mentioned. We want to know about the key employees. We want to know their history. We will do surreptitious background checks on them. We want to know their commitment to the company. We want to know exactly what it's going to take for us to retain that employee after closing or completion. And we want to interview the key employees, and we'll even go beyond that. We want to contract with the key employee before we close with the vendor or seller. And we'll make it worthwhile. We'll make it worthwhile for the key employee or two to stay. So when the owner exits, he knows that the company won't blow up because his key employee holds ransom on the buyer, and the buyer knows he's got the key employee committed for a period of time where everyone wins.
We've found the key employees and employees in general, and I think this may as well be a technology thing rather than a broader industry thing, tend not to be so much of a problem. We do the same thing. We establish conditions precedent in the contract. So after we sign and before anybody writes a check, we're talking to all the employees and making sure they're comfortable to come across, and some customers as well, you know, as a part of the extended due diligence. But the real issue in the long term is typically those very senior principals, you know, who are the vendors. There may be majority or minority shareholders, and if you need them on board, that's a very risky proposition. Small businesses you do, and you know that guy who's spent 10 years building his company to get to there, if you give him a big paper bag full of money, are you expecting him to come in on Monday motivated and working for you instead of working for himself? So actually, we were talking about pitfalls of deals and such, and that's probably the one I see most frequently. And it doesn't actually happen in the deal process. It happens in the 6 to 12 months after. And those principals will come on board. They'll, you know, during the deal process, they're keen to work with you and all that. But afterwards, when, you know, you've got to tell them what to do and they've got to not do what they want to do, we see probably half of them wash out between 6 and 12 months after the sale. And we're always very conscious when structuring earnouts that you've got to be able to unwind it. You know, if you get the shits with each other in 6 months' time, if you've got a financial commitment that goes 36 months out, how do you manage that relationship? So we're always very conscious of that.
Well, we're very keen on this whole idea of transition. We want that transition agreement with the exiting owner, even if the owner is not exiting immediately. We want that nailed down. We want really strong reps and warranties. We want recourse against the seller, and the seller being the human being, not the vendor, the business that we bought. So that we're not just buying writing a blank check and buying a promise.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, to some extent, when you start relying on the warranties and collecting on the warranties, you've already lost the game. But you know, at that point, it's a matter of salvaging and recouping what you can. As brokers and middlemen, it's kind of our job to think through all of those scenarios and make sure there is that recourse when things get difficult.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I find so disturbing are buyers who have been on the internet reading about reps and warranties, and they'll say things to me like, "Hey, listen, if we don't get the truth, well, we'll just sue the owner." Well, good luck doing that, because your business could be in the toilet. They have your money, and And wait till you find out what it's going to cost for a law firm to handle this.
Absolutely. This is a lesson I tell my clients over and over again. I say between about $5,000 and about $250,000, you have to consider that you really do not have any contractual protection from the courts. Because for, a $50,000 or $60,000 issue, are you going to throw $150,000 at running a case over 2 years' time to finally get to the end and essentially flip a coin? That's not a risk that's worth taking. So you really don't want to wind up in court no matter what. And again, that's our job.
And that's the last point I want to make. It relates to cash flow, because everything we're talking about here affects cash flow. And one of the things I try to help the buyers understand is expect, and doesn't mean it's bad, it's just normal. Expect a reduction in revenue or turnover after closing or completion. For some reasons, companies don't get that spurt of growth in that first year, right?
Absolutely, every single time. And when we structure an earnout based on hitting the fantastic forecast they had last month, that dip that always happens when everyone's distracted and things are going poorly, or even if they're going well, we're busy doing integration work and not selling, that hits the earnout, and that often triggers the bumps in the road that lead to a relationship breaking down. But your first 6 months after an acquisition, or 100 days, I like the Jack Welch G 100-day, but that's going to be a bumpy road. And I think one lesson that all buyers need to learn is through that integration period, you've got to keep them selling. Not selling is the biggest way for that to fall over in 6 months. Yeah.
Absolutely. Just in closing on that topic, I just helped a buyer in Kent, England, do a deal about 6 weeks ago. And the first marketing thing he did when he got in is revisit the customers that quit doing business with this company in the last couple of years. They revisited them and said, what can we do to have you come back? A built-in customer base if they make the right pitch.
Brilliant. And is that paying off for them?
So far, yeah, it's only been 6 weeks. So
yeah.
But they're getting the meetings. The former customers are talking to them, and I saw they had a board meeting today, and I saw a report, and it said that they're making inroads on that. And the really good news was the former owner has stayed on for a while, and the guy who bought the company is overlaid, as we talked about earlier, the marketing.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a good conversation. I hope sometime we can pick up on some of the things we could have said but didn't say.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk again anytime.
How can people find you?
The website is ICT, that's India Charlie Tango Strategic Consulting.com. All my contact details are listed there pretty publicly.
Okay. Well, it's been terrific. Looking forward to continue the conversation. This is Ted Leverette. I hope what you heard was as enjoyable for you as it was for me, and valuable. Hey, if you're searching for a business right now, or you're planning to search, check out one of my books, How to Prepare Yourself and Find the Right Business to Buy. And my other book is for people evaluating and negotiating deals, How to Buy the Right Business the Right Way. You can get those books at my website, partneroncall.com. I'm Ted Leverette, the business buyer advocate with Partner on Call Network. Thanks for listening, and best wishes for your prosperity.